Okay. Can I go on?
Just about. Yes.
Quite a production here in the studio.
Oh, yes. You've all been through this on the learning curve, and you've suffered through it. But now we seem to have gotten it down. So, okay. So I just want to acknowledge the bad news. I tend to focus on the good news and the history behind the good news. So that's a very narrow slice, but there's this huge context out there of sorrow at Gaza and Israel and Sudan. And I don't want to seem insensitive by focusing on interesting news with history behind it. So I do feel the need, and even within the context of Russia and Ukraine, you've got escalating airstrikes on both sides, on cities and infrastructure. It's terrible. So I'm admittedly narrowing the focus in a maybe a superficial way to what I think is kind of novel and it's got historical ramifications. So we're going to start off at Carol's request and do a little more update on Ukraine. But then I want to get back to the historic ramifications of the conventions, in particularly the role of Californians, which is in harmony with our discussion of the history of California and how interesting it is. And we've already had a little discussion about going back to Sarah, so I won't talk about that again. So, Kursk and Belgorod. Here they are, just this little red thing on this huge map of Russia that has, I think, 14 time zones. So we're just talking about this sliver here, right at the intersection between Ukraine and Russia. So this is a little bit larger map from The Economist, and this has the whole land war. I've made the point over and over again that the naval battle is going on, and Ukraine is winning, even though they don't have any traditional ships. So we're talking about Ukraine and here and Kursk and Belgorod in Russia. And this blue part is the current Ukrainian incursion. The city of Kursk is quite a ways away. There's on the way, there's a nuclear power plant, and the Russians have put up barriers around that. They're also beginning to put up barriers around 10 miles beyond where the Ukrainians are. So there's a buffer zone, but they're building their embattlements like they have in southern Ukraine, where they've been invaded. And then the main action is down here in Donbass. The Russians have these firmly in hand, and they're expanding. And the whole point, many thought, of this incursion was to force the Russians to withdraw from their attack on Pokrovsk. And this is a key city, and it looks like the Russians are going to get it. So there's a lot of sorrow and there's a lot of bad news, but I want to focus on the good news, as is my want. And here's Kursk and Belgorod. So Belgorod, this isn't the first time we've heard about Belgorod. In 2023, there was a Ukrainian sabotage group, irregulars that kind of on their own, at least Ukraine didn't acknowledge them in any way. But they invaded Belgorod in a couple of places, and here's the motley crew that did that. They're Russians. They say they're Russians, and they're called the Freedom Russia Legion, who's very much against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Um, but now, last month, this is a regular operation. These are Ukrainian troops. And we remember initially there were 300. Now it's acknowledged there are at least 1,000 Ukrainian troops who really made a lot of headway. They just overran the border patrol and took a big slice. And everybody was worried, oh, the Russians would strike back and push them out. No, the Russians have not been able to do that. And so what I want to do is, for the moment, leave that there and go back and look at the history of Kursk and Belgorod. I think that's what Carol was wanting. So I want to go back to the beginning for a quick review. It entered history as a Kievan state. What's a Kievan state? Okay, so there was no Kiev until the Vikings came. And the Vikings came and they went down the Dnieper in their boats. Their boats were unique, and they could go in very shallow water. And so they went down the Dnieper and they went down the Volga. And
Down or up?
Good question. So when you're going against the current, I guess you're going up.
Up.
And the right bank and the left bank is when you're going downstream. So the right bank makes sense in this sense. The Dnieper's heading north. The right bank would be Russia. The left bank would be Ukraine. Well,
Sort of.
just kind of, yeah. Thank you. This is the Neva River, which we don't appreciate. It's the fourth largest river in Europe. And we went on a Viking, the name of the company, boat tour from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and that involved the Neva and the Volga waterways. It's all very wet up here, and it's also very wet down here. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So the Vikings came down. The first Danish chief was Rurik. Their goal was Constantinople. That's where all the treasure was. And by the time they came down, Rome was a has-been. But Constantinople was going strong, and they did eventually make it down. But first, they set up the Kievan state, the Kievan Empire. A guy named Prince Oleg started, and these Vikings became Russian noblemen. Eventually, they were called boyars. What's a boyar? It's just a old Viking family that had warlords that had so much power they could establish fiefs. All right, so a dramatic presentation of the Vikings meeting the Slavs. And the Slavs were disorganized and not very good fighters, and they fell prey to the bandits of the day, and they eventually made a deal that, hey, we'll make you our noblemen if you'll protect us. So the ultimate Viking was Vladimir. He was about fourth or fifth generation Viking. And he made the decision to become a Eastern Orthodox Christian. He, I think the emissaries from Rome wanted him to become a Western a Christian, like the Poles. The Poles became Western Catholics. But he said, nah, it was an easy boat ride down to Constantinople, and the Sophia,
Hagia
Hagia Sophia, thank you, was so impressive. And he went with Constantinople, and he made the decision. And when the prince decides to become a Christian, everybody gets baptized. So this is a mass baptism on the Dnieper. Unfortunately, the Mongols got as far to the west as Kiev, and there was a very messy interlude with the Mongol raiders coming in. And the Mongols eventually went into a partnership with the Tatars, who were a northern people just to the east of the Slavs. And they deputized the Tatars to be the tax collectors for them. And this is the period of the Golden Horn, and the chief tax collector were the Moscow princes. That's how Moscow got their first bit of power, by being tax collectors for the Tatars who were still working for the Mongols. That's the way and that lasted 200 years. Unfortunately, that meant that Russia missed out on the Reformation and the Renaissance, two interesting developments in European culture. And that has had lingering consequences, missing out on a Reformation period and a Renaissance for the Russians. Okay, now in come the Western Europeans in the form of the Lithuanians. So they came and the Mongols left, and they came in and to the vacuum. And now you have the connection that we see even now in the history of Ukraine, the tug between East and West. So the Lithuanians were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Look at the size of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's the largest political entity in Europe by far. Now, you have today's borders superimposed just so we can keep our perspective. So these aren't the borders of the 1600s, but look at the size of that. So that's a real challenge, and it required some political infrastructure. So this was their constitutional convention, as it were, that nationalists, Polish and Lithuanian, Baltic nationalists, and some Ukrainian nationalists celebrate to this day, this moment. There was you're not going to call it a democracy, but there was at least a spread of the power among the nobility, and a structure where they would get together and at least try to talk it out. And we saw evidence of remnants of that when we visited Warsaw and went into the museums there. Then here's the wild card: Cossacks. So they talk about Zaporizhian Cossacks. We're talking about the nuclear plant at Zaporizhia all the time, right? So Zaporizhia is roughly this purplish area to the north, just to the north of the Black Sea, right on the Sea of Azov. We've been talking a lot about the Sea of Azov and that the Kursk Bridge that goes across here. But the Zaporizhian Cossacks were representative of many groups of Cossacks. And who were they? They were just basically wild men who learned to survive in the swamps. All of the South was swampland. And once the swamps were drained, that left behind this rich soil. That's the breadbasket of the arguably one of the baskets of the world, the Volga breadbasket as well as the Ukrainian breadbasket. But as they drained the swamps, Catherine the Great came in. The Cossacks were mobile, so they headed north, and one of the places they went to was Belgorod, either to escape the nobility or at the invitation of the nobility. There was this strange push-pull with mercenaries. You know, we can call them Cossacks, but they're basically mercenaries, warlords. And unfortunately, we're in the last 20 years of world history has been kind of a retro a move to warlords, and you can look around the world and see evidence of that. And of course, Putin is the biggest warlord of them all. But he's turned places like Chechnya into just a warlord center. The Chechens are not only in Ukraine, but they're in Africa, and so it's a strange time we live in. So the Cossacks. And they also were fighting the Turks here in the Sea of Azov. And this next painting is one of my favorite. We've seen it repeatedly. This is a famous artist who really in this painting captures what the Cossacks were. They were just wild guys. Think of our American West and the lawless period and the gangs that Gary Cooper had to fight off in High Noon.
These guys look a little more like Mad Max. Really wild.
Yeah, they're really wild. And the title of this is they're writing a letter to the Ottomans who had sent these Turkish pirates into the Sea of Azov. And they've defeated the Turkish ships, and now they're writing a letter of demands and having a good old time, demanding a lot. They've probably captured a lot of the Turkish prisoners and want to exchange them. Okay, Kursk. So they. Cossacks became kind of an alliance with Moscow. Moscow had expanded from just being tax collectors into themselves being the new power, and they saw these Cossacks moving in, and they contacted them and they said, "Hey, Cossacks, why don't you ally with us?" And they did around 1650, right in the middle there. They started talking more to Moscow. Now, the Cossacks, you might imagine, were a fickle bunch, and they constantly were turning on allies, constantly turning on each other. And so It was certainly unstable, but Moscow had their foot in the door now in Ukraine in the form of the Cossacks. The fact that some of the Cossacks were loyal to Ukrainians can be found in the Ukrainian national anthem. In the second stanza of the Ukrainian national anthem, there's something about our wonderful Cossack brothers. So go figure. Over time, though, Belgorod became a Russian military and administrative center. And Moscow spread out their tentacles with a lot of give and take, push and pull, treachery, mutinies, and we see mutinies down in that area even now. And so it wasn't particularly stable. But Peter the Great came in. He won a big victory at Poltava, which Bob brought to our attention a long time ago. A key battle. Who was Peter fighting? The Swedes. The Swedes were down there trying to get into. So before Napoleon, before Hitler, you had the Swedes. I think it was Charles something. I can't remember which Swede it was. But the Cossacks were right in the middle of that. But Peter kind of consolidated things down there, so that into the 19th and 20th century, Kursk and Belgorod were kind of connected together as one unit. And the administration of Russian power. The problem.
John, can I just, since you've moved on to the 19th century, I thought I'd just add that unfortunately Poltava, where the battle by Peter the Great against the Swedes took place, is of course in the news today.
Yes.
And I seem to recall that back in 2022, that Putin was really aiming to occupy Poltava in time for the annual military parade.
Oh, that's right.
Because he sees himself, I guess, a little bit as Peter the Great, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, or Catherine. It all depends. Sometimes Nicholas the First. Anyway. So an oblast is a Russian for province or state. Thanks for clearing that up. Okay, so Jim's sent this map in, which fits in just perfectly and was a stimulus for me to get back to discussing this area. Here you see the language map, and the red line is the current boundary between Ukraine and Russia, but there's certainly a lot of Ukrainian speakers on the other side of that line. And of course, Putin's main point is there are a lot of Russian speakers in Donetsk as well. So there's a lot of fluidity culturally and linguistically across these current lines, which are kind of just a conventional drawing, a best guess of where it makes sense. But here we've got a lot of people dying over these concepts. Very sad. I mentioned it last month, the Battle of Kursk. Since it was the largest battle in the history of warfare, I'm not embarrassed to mention it again. And I found a new map that kind of showed the Germans in the red as they're trying to. What they're trying to do is make up for the Battle of Stalingrad, which they had lost the month before. And they're throwing everything into taking this bit of territory, and what they want to do is capture a lot of Russian prisoners for slave labor. That was the way that they saw Slavs. That's the way Hitler saw Slavs, as being a source of slave labor. So one of the costliest and fiercest battles, certainly of the Second World War and maybe ever, Germany suffered extensive losses of men and tanks, and it was on the back foot for the rest of the war after they lost this battle. It was at least in Stalingrad, they'd had some initial success, and it was the Russian counterattack that did in winter that did them in. They weren't counting on Russians counterattacking in winter, but they did, and they won. This was a summer offensive. And it's the first time the Russians won a summer offensive. And this was seen as the last gasp of Nazi aggression. It was a bit like our battle at Midway with the Japanese, where we took out their aircraft carriers. That kind of set the tone for the rest of World War II. Well, the Battle of Kursk was like that in Europe, and I just want to show this general again, because he is one of Russia's greatest heroes in this battle. So moving on, question.
Yeah, I don't know if you can go back to the map, but no.
Your map?
Yeah. So I wanted to point out that this is 1897 census. And of course, there was a huge pogrom that Stalin in the 30s that wiped out some 2 million Jews. And he moved a bunch of Russians into Ukraine area to harvest and so forth. So this is an old map, but it does show the origins of the Ukrainian language being dominant.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
And John Homer here. Going forward to your next map, this one. Oh, I thought that the push and both battles was in part to get at oil fields in southern Ukraine. Is that not correct?
No, I think Homer, it was Stalingrad, and the idea at Stalingrad was to open the way down to Azerbaijan. I'll have to go back and make sure of that.
And there was oil in Azerbaijan.
No, there are tons of oil in Azerbaijan.
They were going for oil, but
They were going for oil, but this curse was not about that.
I don't think so. I think it was
Belgorod's right there. I mean, it's right.
Where is
Belgorod? It's right. Isn't that Belgorod that you were just talking about?
Just
down right there.
But Belgorod is right
here. Right there, right at the edge of where the push has been in the heat of the
and so Belgorod down here and Kursk up here, the city of Kursk here. So this just reconcile this map with the previous map.
Right.
Yeah. I know Ukraine's got a lot of gas. I'm not sure about oil.
Okay, now makes sense. Azerbaijan makes sense.
Yeah. And that's where they were going to head down and go through Turkey, and that would be that. Okay, moving past World War II, this guy Nikita Khrushchev survives and goes through World War II. is noticed as an up and coming star. And by 1954, Stalin was dead, and he was in power. And he was born in the area of Kursk, in a small town here. And this was not only was Belgorod given its own independence from Kursk, but Khrushchev gave the administrative responsibility of Crimea to the Ukraine. So it would be in America just saying, okay, Arizona, you're in charge of the River, not California anymore. And it didn't seem like that big a deal, but it made Khrushchev feel good because he was basically Ukrainian. And he probably is in that green zone on Jim Teisel's map where he grew up speaking Ukrainian. And so he gave administrative responsibility for Crimea to Ukraine, and that meant he was taking it away from the main Russian state. And of course, this had no consequence whatsoever until Ukraine and Russia became separate countries. And all of a sudden, the Navy that had been stationed in Sevastopol was all of a sudden in charge, belonged to a foreign country as far from the Russian point of view. Just looking at the different and the maps between last month and this month. This is the Institute for the Study of War. They've come out with the best maps and the best data, and you can see that the Ukrainians have filled this in fairly nicely, far from being pushed back. They've extended and solidified, consolidated, and so they've gained 300 square meters. They've done it with at least 1,000 troops, probably more. They control 28 settlements, and they've got 600 prisoners of war that they can bargain with as time goes on. So it's been a success for them. What they're after is reaching the Sem River, and I think the Sem River runs somewhere like this. You can't see it very clearly on the map, but it's northwest of their solid holdings now. But they're trying to make the Sem River their boundary, and that would expand even more. They've knocked out bridges, which has isolated Russian soldiers to the south. And now the Ukrainians have a good chance of capturing these soldiers. And they can use the river as a defensive line against any counterattacks. They can also disrupt any transportation along the river in boats or across the river on the bridges. And so the rivers are really important in warfare. We're learning this in this particular war. And we've seen it with the Dnieper River in the area of Kherson, how strategic that is. So the Ukrainians have knocked out 3 bridges. The Russians are digging in about 10 miles to the northwest of where the current Ukrainian line. So there's going to be at least a buffer zone there, and the Ukrainians will try to occupy all of that. But they're blowing up the bridges. Ukrainians, they're not advancing as quickly as before, but they're untroubled because they think they've won. They've made their point that Ukrainian weapons and Ukrainian initiatives can get around Russia's superior numbers. And when they were making these moves, they've synchronized it with a lot of drone attacks on Russian cities. And these are Ukrainian drones. And what they're trying to do is prove to America, just like Churchill proved to America. We went through a number of examples of George Washington proving to the French that we were worth a risk. And I think this is similar. Ukrainians have been successful, at least they feel they've been successful in showing what can be achieved. And all this with the goal of getting America in particular to loosen restrictions on where American weapons can be used within Russia. So they're within Russia at this point using their own weapons, and they're just saying it'd really be nice if we could use American weapons. They're using American equipment like at least what Bradley trucks, I think they're called, transportation, if not tanks. There are American weapons and NATO weapons on Russian soil now. So what about Belgorod? Most of the action has been in Kursk. But there's been quote unquote spillovers from the action there into Belgorod, and border guards and border villages have been impacted, at least with raids. But here's a tantalizing mystery. There are unused reserve troops that nobody knows where they are, and they may be among the clustering of Ukrainian troops on the Belgorod border. And one high official was quoted as saying, "We've got another surprise coming up, so who knows? Stay tuned." So. However, the main goal was to make the Russians retreat in the Donbass and pull out troops, and that has failed. Russia has continued to apace to move in the Donbass, where they really man Ukrainians 10-1 by some counts. And then today's news that Bob just mentioned, Poltava is suffering a heavy bombardment. Okay, a segue to the history of California. I'll resort to anything to get back to the history of California. Sebastopol, California. How did Sebastopol get a name for a port city in the Crimea? And so I went to good old Wikipedia, and apparently the name was changed from Pine Grove to Sebastopol after an epic bar fight in the 1850s. Which took place at the time local newspapers were reporting the epic siege of Sebastopol by the British against the Russians in the Crimean War. So how Sebastopol got its name. All right, so questions before we shift gears. I don't have too much time. Yeah, Shigeko.
Do the Europeans have any restrictions on the use of their equipment in Russia?
Um, I, I think the only country that would be affected would be the British. And because I think only they are supplying what are the Storm Shadow missiles. And I think they have the same restriction that Americans do on the use of Storm Shadow. The Storm Shadow missiles have been key in the Battle of the Black Sea, and they've been used to attack Sevastopol. And the Storm Shadow missiles have forced the retreat of Russians from the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. But remember, everybody considers Crimea to be Ukrainian. Nobody's recognized that as being part of Russia. So
That's why storm shadows can be used. Yeah, the UK has the same restrictions as the US.
Yeah, but hasn't Poland given like F-16s to Ukraine? I think it has.
yeah, but I think the F-16s have the same restriction.
I know one was shot down recently, so they are using them.
Yeah, they're using them, and maybe on the border, but you know, these restrictions are somewhat loose around Kharkiv. So when a major Ukrainian city is at risk, these restrictions are loosened. So I think if there was a group of Russian soldiers on their side of the border that was pointing towards Kharkiv, they could be used. But you know, this is war, and it's pretty foggy, and who knows what's going to happen. But
The people who make the missiles will make money.
well, one way or the
The
other,
military-industrial complex will do well,
yes,
right?
and they
arguably, the goal, one of the goals.
and they work very well with warlords and mercenaries.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. All right. And any other comments? I at least want to get started on the so you know where I'm going with the conventions. Where I'm going really is with a story of Ezra Klein. It's more than just my thinking that he's been a really good commentator. It turns out a lot of people do, and I wanted to talk about that. But he got my attention after the Republican convention when all the Republicans were high. It was post-assassination, and they were really feeling it. And Ezra that night said, "No, hold on, Democrats can still win." And when he said, here's how what this might mean for Democrats. He got us to focus, and then after with the Democrat convention, right after that, he wrote another column, and he said, I'd been a proponent of an open convention, and there's really after this was just before Biden dropped out. I misspoke. The timing just before Biden dropped out after the Republican convention. He said, I've been for an open convention, but talking to Democrats, there's not much of an appetite or time. And Kamala hasn't been that bad. She had a bad reputation because of her 2020 run. And she said ever since Biden screwed up at the debate, she's been very good on the stump. And, she's kind of done a quiet audition. And given that the time period's very short and there's a big pressure to unite, if Biden endorses Kamala, it'll be almost irresistible. So last week, the New Yorker, feeling what I've felt about Ezra, just said how Ezra Klein helped set the stage for Kamala Harris's nomination. And Ezra is going to be one of my connections to get us back to talking about California. But I'll get to that. But when he was talking about things, this kind of gets us back to California. He said one of the things that really turned him off about Biden was the Hur report. So what's the Hur report? He was a special counsel that was appointed by Merrick Garland to investigate Biden's mishandling of public documents. And you maybe remember, he said he interviewed Biden and he found him a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. And at the time, we're all going, well, who does this Republican think he is? This was a hit job. At least that was my reaction, not knowing anything about Robert Hur. But now I do, and Ezra did know him about him, because Ezra is also from Southern California, and Robert Hur's from L.A., Korean parentage, father in the medical racket. Familiar story. Harvard, Cambridge, Stanford Law, just collecting all the accolades along the way. And eventually he becomes a deputy attorney general appointed by Trump. So Trump appointed him. And I was familiar with him because I do listen to the conservative source of news, the Dispatch, and one of their reporters had positive things to say about Robert Hur. So Ezra listened, but it was really Biden's press conference where he confused the leaders of Mexico and Egypt. And he finally wrote an opinion and says, hey, the regular Democrats like Nancy Pelosi need to talk to Biden and get him out of the race. And Ezra Klein at the time took a lot of heat. A lot of heat. I remember, who does he think he is? The president of the United States, trying to shunt him aside. But he was calling on Democrat leaders to dump Biden back in February. So I said there was a California connection. He grew up in Irvine. His father was an immigrant mathematician that taught at Irvine. From Brazil, immigrated from Brazil. There's a Jewish community there, and we have an interesting story about encountering the first synagogue in the New World, and Sife. It was built when the Dutch were here. The Dutch were here before the Portuguese. And this, the first synagogue in the New World was built around 1630s, and they were kicked out eventually from Brazil. The Dutch were, and so where did these Jews go? They went to New Amsterdam. They went to New York, and built a synagogue there. So getting back to Ezra. An interesting story, just a terrible student at Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz, it's not that hard to be a good student at Santa Cruz, I'm going to say.
That's not true.
Okay.
All three of my kids went there, and it's actually pretty competitive.
Okay, well, he couldn't compete. He came up with a GPA of 2.2. Yeah. But nevertheless, he went to Washington, D.C., became a blogger, and just on pure talent, he was a terrible student. And thank you for the correction on Santa Cruz. It's not just a beach school. Okay.
That's Santa Barbara.
Okay. I stand corrected. But he works his way up just on sheer talent. first with the Washington Post. And I remember I was following him as a blocker back then. And I remember when he started a new news site with Matt Iglesias called Vox. His strong point is he's really curious and he branches out and gets different opinions, gets interesting people to come in. And he's therefore now his New York Times podcast is one of the top podcasts around. And he was interviewed for this article in the New Yorker. And the interviewer thought, this guy has just built up over the years, the decade really, a lot of political capital, and he's spending it by trying to get rid of the president. And Ezra responded, said, look, I was just trying to open up a conversation that I thought had been prematurely closed, and he was right to do it. He thought he was hearing for Democrats in private bad things about Biden. He was just trying to set up, quote unquote, a permission structure. And it's interesting how much power he had because he interviewed Walz like 4 days before Walz was selected for vice president. But he interviewed on his podcast, and this will be where I stop, but I want to at least get through this. He interviewed Nancy Pelosi on his podcast, and it's clear from the two Californians they had a connection. And even at one point in the interview, Nancy Pelosi reaches over and taps his arm affectionately. You don't see that often, but it happened. And she allowed Ezra to go deep into what her role was for getting Biden to drop out. You'll remember that Biden had slammed the door on any efforts to get him out. And he wrote a letter and he says, we're done with this. I'm not dropping out. And what's Pelosi's response? It didn't sound like Joe Biden. So she just kind of willfully didn't want to hear it. And she dismissed it. It didn't sound like Joe Biden, as if somebody else had written it. And so she goes on to Morning Joe TV and says, well, it's up to the president to decide, as if he hadn't decided. He slammed the door. We're done. He had decided, and she pretended like he hadn't decided. And so he reopened the space for continuing the conversation. It's interesting. She later went on the Bill Maher show, and she does not have that kind of relationship with Bill Maher. So she was much more circumspect. And I think what she did is told Bill Maher, don't ask me about my role in getting Biden to drop out. I've already done it. This is a comedy show. I'm not going to do it. I think that's what happened. But it led to this very funny exchange. I'll let you read it.
You didn't do. Was that her to him?
That's him to her.
Him to her.
Yeah, him to her. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart so much for doing what you didn't do. And so to Ezra, she said, I just didn't accept the letter as anything but a letter. Let's talk about this again next week. A wedge in the door. And Ezra said she'd seen her do this with the Affordable Care Act. So they have a familiarity. She's on because she's written a book, which might be an interesting book to read.
The Art of Power.
The Art of Power, and she's got it. And Ezra said, in addition to Biden and Obamacare, she'd been right on Iraq, and that's to be right on those three things is pretty good. Okay, so I want to get back to the Bay Area next week. They talk about the Bay Area and how it has outsized influence in national politics. And if you stop and think about the history of it, it's really true. And Julia will be here next week. She expressed fondness for San Francisco. I think we all have that, and some of us even live in San Francisco. So that'll be where I'll stop. And so I hope that I'll stop share and I'll see people on the screen. You all still there?
I think Kamala is going to help us keep punching above our weight in the Bay Area.
Yes, that's good. And we're going to take credit for that in the East Bay.
Absolutely. Oakland too. Yeah. You notice that she never refers to her background at Berkeley. It's Oakland.
I'm sorry, there was some commotion here. What was that?
Oh, she refers often to her background in Oakland, but she doesn't bring up Berkeley.
Oh no. Oh no. But anyway, so what was that shooting in San Francisco recently?
Well, that was the shooting of a guy who's a running back or something.
Yeah,
Wide receiver through the chest. But he was going to play. He's just going to miss the first 4 games. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. He got immediate care, and I guess it didn't get any major vessel because
you're all physicians. How on earth do you get shot in the chest and walk out of hospital the next day?
It doesn't get a big vessel, that's for sure.
Doesn't go through your aorta and
no, it just went through some lung, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, he was discharged like a day after admission.
Yeah.
Well, there was another Californian, Ronald Reagan, who got shot in the chest and lived to talk about it. So Californians getting shot in the chest have good luck.
Actually, if they sent him out the next day, they didn't even get his lung.
No.
Yeah, you would think he'd have a big pneumothorax. So what do they mean by through the chest? I don't know where in the chest he was hit.
It could be just somewhere between the belly button and the neck. To most people, that's what the chest is. That could be a glancing blow off of the shoulder or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. You're right. If he went home the next day, he didn't have much.
Right.
Similar to the case of the ear that was blown off recently.
Well, what I thought was interesting is I was down at a sports bar by campus, and they were carrying the shooting, because usually a sports bar has the football game or the basketball game or something. But for a while they had the police scene. It looked like, Fox News or CNN. They were covering the shooting of a sports person. But that's the only reason they were covering. It was an interesting, when two worlds collide.
Okay. When I point the camera, I'm not sure what you're all seeing because I can't see for some reason on my screen. But on the other side, we have Aiko and Rudy. Any other questions, comments?
Oh, poor Father Sarah. He's just stuck in San Diego.
Well, I've been there for at least 6 months.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do to try to get us off the dime. I'm going to distribute the index of the 7 links where we, at least in part of the link, talk about Father Sierra. If anybody wants to start over from there, some of our newcomers might be an ideal way. I think Father Sarah's story is pretty incredible. So I'm not embarrassed to do that. All right. Okay, folks. I think that's
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Got to be careful giving a thumbs up signal these days.
Why is that?
Because of Trump doing it at Arlington.
Oh.
What a stuff.
Okay.
Here I can finally see what they're
What I look
saying.
like.
There you are.
Yeah, can you imagine if a Democrat did that? Republicans, what they do.
Oh, they go crazy. Yeah. All right.
John,
Yes, Jim.
you have a couple minutes.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should stop recording.